Welcome to another episode of the DNA of Things, where we dive into the intricate world of DNA, how it shapes our lives. Really now it's at the intersection of not just DNA, but our genetics, the environment, and the behavior, understanding the synergy to help you unlock your full potential. Now, today's guest is Dr. Patrick Porter, a pioneer in brainwave technology and the creator of BrainTap. The background in psychology and electronics, Dr. Porter has combined, the art and science of these two interdisciplines and has really a pretty phenomenal career where he's dedicated himself to enhancing mental health through innovative technology. His goal is to unlock the potential in over 1 billion brains. Now, BrainTap is the vehicle. It's a state-of-the-art device that uses light and sound to guide the human brain through various frequencies, promoting focus, mental clarity, and relaxation. In this episode, we dive into Dr. Porter's journey from being labeled learning disabled to becoming a leading figure in neuroscience, an innovator in neuroscience. We discuss the science behind BrainTap, the role of light and sound in brain health and performance, and practical tips for improving said mental performance. You'll learn how to harness your brain's potential and why it's crucial for your well-being and what the future holds for brain technology. Let us dive in. Dr. Patrick Porter, welcome to the DNA of Things.
Hey, it's great to be here, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Your reputation precedes you. I'm sure listeners have likely come across your incredible pursuits, particularly in the realm of call it neuroscience and mental health. And I'm really excited to certainly dive into the technology, the BrainTap, effectively all the different ways and methods it seems that you've integrated, and not in a short time, by the way. It seems your track record goes back decades, at least 2 or 3 decades. So really interested to learn about the technology in detail. But before we dive in, I'm always, and my listeners are always most curious about the people behind the mission. So you're a creator, building a better future, mission to unlock 1 billion brains. Tell me how that mission came to be. So as far back as you want to go to the moment you were called into action. Yeah, I'd love to hear your origin story.
Well, I was in my book, Awaken the Genius. I kind of tell the whole story that people can read that. But I was held back in 2nd grade and told I was learning disabled. And, I was in special classes. There were only 5 to 6 of us in a class up until I was in 6th grade. And my dad became a Silva method instructor, the Silva method, which used something called the Silva sound, which at the time we didn't know was isochronic tones, which is a way that the cortical response in the brain, meaning that the deep inner resources of the brain will follow that frequency and train the brain. That's part of the brainwave optimization that we do at BrainTap. But this was way back in the 70s. And so with the Silva method, what happened was once I started using that method and incorporating more of the alpha brainwave, which my dad taught, and that's what Silva taught, was to increase more of your alpha bandwidth. And I didn't realize, but I do know now through research, that most kids that are on the spectrum of autism have very little or no alpha. So without knowing that, because we didn't have ways to measure it back then, like we do today, I think what happened was I increased my alpha activity and then I became super smart. I became an honor roll student. So went from being in these small classes and held back and told I was learning disabled to being really a super genius. I mean, I was an honor roll student all the way through high school and on the dean's list and things during college. And I think it all happened because I activated that part. That's why I call it Awaken the Genius. I think that brainwaves unlock our genius potential. And I don't think I'm super special in that way. I just think that I was capable because of my dad's background to unlock it. Now, in the 70s, I started helping my dad. When I went to school in the 80s, I continued to help him. I went to school for electronics. So when people think, why do I have electronics with psychology? Well, I wasn't going to do psychology. I was going to do electronics. And so I went to school for that. And then I realized I really didn't like working on robots. And they weren't robots like you think about today. They were solenoids and things like that. It was a little different back then. When you think about electronics today, it's very different than it was in the 70s and 80s.
Mhm.
We've made quantum leaps. But I got to work with a company called Light and Sound Research, which is a whole nother kind of almost mystical story how we met. It was a person actually told me to go to Vegas. I was going to meet a person there, told me her name, and then I was going to learn about this technology. So, I mean, some people will take that and say that's hogwash, but it's exactly what happened. I met the person and they had a piece of technology called the sills. And the sills machine was a big unit, looked like a microwave, and you had to do it by hand. There was no, think of electronics before processing chips. There was no processing chips. When the EEPROM chip came out, we were able to take what I was doing mechanically because I was doing it by hand. So imagine the light changes and the frequency changes. That was all being done by switches, by a
Wow.
program. So we were able to take those and make them into something called the MC Square, which was the first portable light and sound machine, which we developed in the 80s. And then that's kind of what started me on my trip. Now, think about it, in the 80s, there were no cell phones, there were no CDs, there was no internet like we know it today. And I come out with this piece of technology, nobody knew what it was. So in order to get it out to the masses, I started a franchise company. That franchise company, we had 108 locations. I sold that in 2002, but I retained the rights to my equipment. So that company unfortunately went out of business in 2012. They went on for 10 years without me, but because of a number of things, they didn't last. But I then recreated the equipment in 2013, and we call it BrainTap. And so what I did, think of taking something as big as a little microwave, and now all fits into an earphone. It all fits into earphones and a visor. So we were able to miniaturize the whole thing. And then of course, working with apps, we are in an app configuration. So we have an app. So around the world, we have 120,000 users. So around the world, people can use it with just the app alone. Now they don't get the benefits of light, which I'm sure we're going to get into during this conversation, but they will get the influence of sound because sound is very healing to the body as well. So there's a lot of research out there just with sound alone. So what we did is we did the same thing, binaural beats. Some of your listeners might be familiar with what those are. If I wanted to get you into alpha, which is a 10 hertz frequency, it's actually between 7 and 12 hertz frequency is alpha bandwidth, but 10 they consider let's say, neutral to the brain. So when you're in that creative state and you're just kind of daydreaming, that's the brainwave state. If I wanted to produce that brainwave state, I would have to produce a 300 hertz frequency in one ear and a 310 hertz frequency in the other. It could be any variation of those, but as long as there was 10 hertz between those two, when I'm putting it into the right ear and the left ear, the brain doesn't hear the 300 or the 310. It only hears a phantom sound of 10 hertz. What we discovered, which no one had done that before, was we could do that biocular, which means we did it with light. So we're doing the same thing with light. So we're adding light and sound. And then what we did is we actually included into it frequencies. Now, this all happened over time. The first one we had was just binaural beats and light. Then we added isochronic tones binaural beats. Then we added isochronic tones binaural beats, Noget frequencies, Rife frequencies, all these different frequency generations that we have now. So now we have a full spectrum, and no one has to do anything by hand anymore. What we did is we have protocols on the app. We have over 2,400 sessions. So we have a playlist, if you will, that train the brain to whatever you want to do. I mean, there are so many different ways from sports athletes like TB12, which is Tom Brady's group for recovery. We work with them in the sports world, to Julia Arndt, who we work with the top 1 producers in business in peak performance, to show how the brain does this, to working with people in Australia to show them how to improve your brain for sleep. So you can go from learning deficit like I had to sleeping problems. The brain controls all those things. So we can kind of delve into those if you'd like. That's kind of my backstory, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, okay. Really cool. Here's some things that pop to mind. Let me just say them and we'll back into them. So let's say MC2, synchronicity, i.e. Carl Jung, and the Silva method. You said, a couple of really interesting things there. And actually, maybe before I go into those questions, so there's Dr. Patrick Porter, the PhD. What's the PhD in?
It's in Christian psychology.
That's what I thought. Okay. Yeah. And so then, you paired that with, it seems like electronics. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
I went to school. My undergraduate's in electronics.
Got it. Got it. Wow. Okay. It's like you were born into the exact moment in history, moments before the singularity, right?
Right.
I'm sure we'll dive into that. But MC2, I mean, I wanted to just make sure I understood that, because it seems to me, this being the first personal light and sound training machine seems to be maybe not the core isn't the right word, but certainly the beginnings of your technology. And just for the benefit of listeners, is this was voted best new gadget of the year in 1989. Is that correct? The Consumer Electronics Show?
Yeah. I mean, you could imagine at the Consumer Electronics Show, they used to hold it in Chicago at that time, not Vegas where they do now. And we would have a line of people at the booth that went on for almost 400 yards. I mean, back then they had what they called booth bunnies. So they had the Playboy bunnies and Penthouse pets at the booths trying to get people to come in there. And people were standing in line because we were on the front cover of one of the dailies, they call them, because we had 6 chairs. And you remember going to the event where people were relaxing in zero gravity chairs. But back then we had little sling chairs you'd use in your backyard, like for sun tanning. And the Rolling Stones were playing behind us.
Come on.
And these people looked like they were passed out. And of course, when you're at an event like the Consumer Electronics Show, people are tired. They're walking around the trade show floor. We gave them a way to get a reprieve, and people loved it, but they didn't understand it. They really didn't understand what it was, because we were like a foreign invader. We were like aliens coming down from another planet, teaching them about. Nowadays, people understand it because we've been in this field for like 40 years. So but it took a long time for people to understand how the brain works. With the science is actually called frequency following response, if you look in the science literature.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Just other couple of questions for clarification. This idea of synchronicity. So you received a premonition or a forecast or a fortune teller's insight, to go and be and do these things. And that's for folks who listening who study any psychology, which you have. Carl Jung has dived into some questionable areas in his research, not excluding things like psychedelics, but would try to understand dreams, try to understand premonitions, try to understand synchronicity. This may be a little off the topic of this conversation, but I just kind of hit a nerve, because I had a previous conversation with an individual, Dr. Garrett Yount, out of the Institute of Noetic Science. He wrote a book called Why Vibes Matter, but our conversation danced around a lot of this, call it emerging perspective, emerging research around collective consciousness. It makes me think of some of the work that, what's his name? Dispenza, Joe Dispenza, right? So these are all, they're all really interesting perspectives, and are, I hesitate to say on the fringe, but I mean, certainly it is there's a new resurgence of actually focus on understanding, augmented states or different states of consciousness. So I don't want to discount what you're saying. And, when I hear things like that, I'm very interested by them because I don't understand them, certainly separating out various cognitive biases versus, coincidence versus causality. We can't help but get metaphysical in these conversations, but let's just kind of, put that in a box for now, and maybe it opens up later. But the Silva method, I believe, maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, because it sounds like it's a little bit, that was a jumping off point for you. Now, I believe the Silva method was, was captured and redistributed by, there's an app or a company called the Mind Valley. I think, is that the same?
I think they bought the rights to it. Yeah.
Okay.
When my dad did it, my dad was, after he got help with alcoholism using the Silva method, it helped him to get off alcohol. He became one of their first instructors in America. We had a territory. So if you think of it, it used to be like almost like a franchise. We had Southwestern Michigan. So every 2 weeks, my dad and my brother and I, or my brothers, depending upon how many we needed, would go and help my dad do a seminar with 30 to 40 people. And he would take them through this technique. And Silva was best known because he actually, and I don't know how true it is, but he seemed to have the money to back it up. He actually used the Silva method to win the Mexican lottery 3 times. So, which means he was able to go to level, they call it, which is going into this alpha state and going into consciousness and retrieving the numbers for the lottery. Now in Mexico, it's different because you got to go to the store that sells those numbers. So he got in his car and went to the actual store that sold the numbers to the lottery, and he won it 3 times. And that's how he founded Silva. Now, a number of Silva people have actually won the lottery as well. I've never won the lottery. I'd never had that opportunity to get the numbers given to me. But what I would say is that just like a lot of people talk about, like the law of attraction and these kind of things that people work on, that we are vibratory frequency beings. We're light, sound, and vibration, and we're teeming with energy. And that pulsing vibration is actually magnetic in nature. We know that. It's now science. It's not metaphysical anymore. In fact, NIH actually in 1994, if you go to their website, talks about the biosphere that is around every human being. So that's our aura, which this is our medical community saying that. And they say that all disease starts in the biosphere first. So it starts in the energy field and then manifest into the physical realm. Now, our science proves that, but most of our unfortunate doctors are using still allopathy. So they're going backwards. They're working from physical world to the spiritual world, thinking that we are physical beings instead of we're spiritual beings. We have a physical body, but that's only one body. We have what they showed in the science, and now there's a lot of science about this, that we are literally light beings. In fact, when you talk about genetics, just to kind of put it in perspective for the listeners, because they're probably wondering how we can tie this back to genetics, we can very easily, because when in 2003, when they said they mapped the human genome, we know they didn't. They only mapped 1% of it. And that's the fixed states of our human genome. The 99% they said was junk DNA. In 2018, they said that's not junk DNA anymore. They said that's epigenetics, meaning that the environment, meaning everything, literally everything, from the thoughts you think to the air you breathe, to the people you hang out with, to the books you read, to the podcasts you listen to, everything is influencing your DNA right now. In fact, every 40 seconds, the light that is expressing through your body, which that biosphere, we know that it generates 8-10 nanometer light. So the importance of 8-10 nanometer light is in the science of biohacking, which is now really big, or health optimization, however you want to look at it. They now know that if we absorb 8-10 nanometer light, we heal faster. This is infrared light, also 650 to 810 nanometer light or 850 nanometer light. These are all healing lights to the body because our body wants that energy. The reason that works is something called mitochondria in every cell, and we have what's called the Krebs cycle. So this light that we emit, and the reason I'm going to talk to this audience about it is during COVID, when they did a study showing that people who looked at COVID as a threat versus people that looked at COVID as a challenge, it was very different in the light output that their body produced. And we can measure the light output of a cell. We're all biophotonic in nature. So what happens is the people that looked at life as a challenge rather than a threat, those that looked at it as a threat were producing 200 times less light emission. Now, what does that light emission do? That light emission actually is sending instruction sets to the cell to tell the cell what to do. For instance, think of our sun as the mitochondria for our solar system. If we don't get to bed by 10 o'clock at night, we don't make as much melatonin during the night. If we don't get to bed by 11 o'clock, our liver doesn't get cleansed as well because the cleansing cycle starts at 11. At 2 o'clock in the morning, our temperature increases 2 degrees around the world. No matter where you're at 2 o'clock, your body's going to do this. Now, these are only 3 of the infinite number of things that might be happening in your body that are all programmed by the light from our sun. That's why if you don't get outside and get light, or you don't feed the body light, they say that light is the most underprescribed nutrient on earth today. So when we think about light, we are light. Now, light can be broken down into sound because it's a variation of frequency and vibration. So as you think about this light, sound, and vibration. What we're saying is, with Silva, we would play the sound in the background of the room, and it was an isochronic, so it wasn't binaural. It was played in the room, like in an open room, like you and I are in right now. If we were playing the sound, our brain would synchronize to that frequency. Now, it works because we're doing this all the time. Remember, the epigenetics wasn't something that they invented. It's something they discovered because it was already happening. So for instance, if you and I, Jeremy, went to a mountain, and I'll put it in perspective this way, when Ames Bhopal, which is one of the biggest, the Ames Institute, the All Indian Institute of Medical Sciences, is probably best known for researching altered consciousness. I mean, they're in India. They're the MIT of India. There's six locations. They're our partners. Last year, we were voted Researchers of the Year because we showed how the physiology affects psychology. It increases spirituality because it's consciousness. It's all consciousness. So what we showed them, and when I showed them first the BrainTap, and I said, look, our body's responding to these frequencies. He said, Dr. Porter, you're cheating. I said, what do you mean you're cheating? What I did was I took someone on stage and I measured their brain using EEG. I took a guru on stage, measured their brain, and had them go into a meditative state. We got their profile. I said, I can get the person that you just saw up here that has this chaotic brain to have the same brain state as the guru in less than 10 minutes. And so we did it, and it happened. It does it every time because the brain follows this frequency. And he goes, you know, you're cheating. He goes, that guru meditated for 25 years. And I said, well, have you ever meditated to a candle? And he said, oh yeah, all the time. I said, then you're cheating. That candle is, all fires flicker at 10 hertz frequency. Have you ever been mesmerized by a fire? Like you sit in front of a campfire, and what happens is when your brain's in that 10 cycle rhythm, your body starts to create acetylcholine. There's all these different neurotransmitters our brain creates, but it's based on our environment. So our environment tells our body what to do. So we show up as our best self. Now, if we look at life as a threat, we downregulate the genetic profile and we show up as our worst self. So if we look at life as a challenge, so I said, do you know why the gurus go to the mountains to meditate? And he said, to get away from people. I said, no, they're cheating. He said, what do you mean? When you're sitting at a mountaintop, that mountaintop is frequency generating 7.8 hertz frequency. That's called the Schumann frequency. It's at the tree line of the mountain. So if they're in the Himalayas and they're meditating, they're actually sitting in an isochronic tone generator. Every cell of their body is vibrating at 7.8 hertz frequency. That's theta. Now, theta generates GABA. GABA is a precursor to something called DMT when you're talking about psychedelics. So our body creates all of that with the right stimulus. Even when we do plant-based medicine, which we do a lot, we've done a lot of studies with plant-based medicine and integration with BrainTap, because I think it's a very powerful way to redistribute neuroactivity and get neuroplasticity to happen, and especially with our vets and things like that have super trauma. And it's hard to do what we call neural pruning when the trauma is so intense, because as you think about it, you actually hardwire those in. So we need to have a lot of massive energy in the brain. So if we can create the space, like using psychedelics to more or less kind of blow up everything. And what we know in neuroscience, for the listeners, they know that if we can get one new thought in, so like today, Jeremy, if you and I can give each listener one new thought, just one new thought, their whole brain has to rewire to accommodate that constellation of new thinking because of that one new thought. So if you've ever had a friend where you're trying to convince them about some of these metaphysical concepts and they just won't get it, it's because they're hardwired. It's kind of like telling a Mac user to use a PC, to use an IBM, and an IBM user trying to talk to a PC. They have different formats. So we've all been formatted. So that's why it's so important that, like psychedelics or doing things like BrainTap or getting into meditation, getting into altered states, getting out into nature, grounding, all these things are really helping us to rewire our physiology so that we can adapt. Because the person who adapts survives. Those people who don't adapt, they don't survive.
Yeah, I'm not going to over-index on Jung, but I can't ignore, one of the things that you mentioned there. So one of the things that you said over and over there is, well, you're cheating. One of the things that Carl Jung would say is, well, be careful for cognitive states that you haven't earned, right? But if you're in a state of lack or in a state of injury, yeah, certainly, the psychedelics are, pushing people into, let's say, a state of regeneration, or a state of openness, or a state of regrowth. And, just kind of going back to a couple of things you talked about in addition is like this idea of that we're emitting light, and this idea that, our DNA is not junk. And then let's talk a little bit about the activation of, mitochondria, and maybe use that as a jumping off point to the different light settings that you have on your device, and
Sure.
perhaps how those are paired strategically with sound. But let me just first start on this notion of an aura, of light or energy that you're emitting. I mean, I think it's not a secret that, a lot of these autoimmune disorders that we see, often come from, now I don't want to diminish anybody's position, but it is a state of miscontent or even self-loathing at times. And like, I've seen this, let's just say anecdotally and personally in my family, where, an individual is in a state of chronic inflammation because there are certain things about their life that, they feel victimized for. And, and then lo and behold, a chronic disease, autoimmune disease pops up, and in a way it becomes an identity, and a more kind of progressive or accelerated outcome of the disease was observed. I don't want to name the disease
Correct.
specifically because everybody may be suffering for different reasons. So I don't mean to pigeonhole anybody, or, directly say it's your fault, you're sick. What I'm saying is, what I feel and practice personally is, to the extent that I can remember it, is how to be proactive around how I feel, how to, set up my day strategically, because as you say, a good percentage of that, let's call it the intronic region of your DNA, the space between genes, let's say the non-coding regions, are all so important for this tertiary, or conformational, structure and packing and ordering of the DNA. So that means the accessibility to certain genes, and so that's what you mean when you say epigenetic. A lot of that conformation happens because there are various proteins that are binding the DNA. So acetylation, methylation is, I'm sure it's what people hear a lot about, and how those compounds bind DNA. They basically make gene expression more or less accessible. And you're right, it's precisely the environment you find yourself in, and the exposure to different stressors, fight or flight. I think one of the best studied examples of this is the Dutch hunger famine. So people who were, essentially in the womb during that time, showed in the change, less than a generation change, the increase of prevalence in, obesity and paranoid schizophrenia, which totally makes sense. Resources are in short supply, so good to store whatever you come into contact with. And it's good to be paranoid if people are trying to kill you. So, and those are methylation changes that persisted. And so there's an over indexing of those conditions 1-2 generations into the future. We're now seeing changes in methylation patterns associated with kids who had parents who smoked. We see changes in methylation patterns of, kids who are offspring of athletes, for example. So, and I will say that there's, I come from a pedigree, academically speaking, of people who really love the selfish gene hypothesis, and just the notion that the Richard Dawkins selfish gene hypothesis. My PhD supervisor was Dr. Ford Doolittle. He's most say world renowned for deconstructing Darwin's tree of life, but he's done many other things. And one of his first, I guess, philosophical points of interest is the individual agency or selfishness of genes. And so he might say, from a more, let's say, atheistic point of view, is, well, these genes, they're just good at copying, and they're good at perpetuating. And, it's really stoichiometry. They're the agents of selection. And, we're playing with the hypothesis that there is no function there at all. I just wanted to represent that is an alternative view, but it's a hypothesis. The notion that, we have these emergent studies with epigenetics, and, even now looking at it as, how do we use that signature to predict biological age, connecting people, and, working on that ratio of optimization of chronological versus biological age. It's a really interesting and informative time to be alive. And, coming full circle just on the mitochondria, the energy powerhouse of the cell, in exactly in that mitochondria, you've got essentially compounds, cytochromes, that do absorb light right in that electron transport chain, right where the ATP is made. And I mean, I can say, talk about synchronicity. I was visiting with family last week, and I said, I'm going to specifically focus on more rejuvenation tactics. I did a lot of infrared sauna and cold tub to flush, et cetera. But, 4 infrared saunas in a week, on vacation. And what I can say is the inflammation, it's like I have a whole new body, right? It's like the tonacity of the muscle and the closeness of the skin is, I would call it a tensegrity that I don't normally feel. So what that means is a structurally functional synergy of, the body's tissues, which by comparison, usually when I'm in that accelerated state of stress, fight or flight, there's a lot of that, counterproductive holding going on. So all of these things that you're saying, they make sense. And there's a lot of, it seems, interdisciplinary concepts that are coming together. I love the bridge of the physical and the spiritual side of things. So let's go with that. Let there be light. Let us talk about, this. How is it, for example, I was just doing some research ahead of our call. Take us through, the delta waves, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. These are all associated with different states. So is it true that you said you have over 2,000 programs, on your device, on the BrainTap device? Is it true that we can start to think about leveraging that strategically, say for, if I have to, jump into a meeting or I would say a meeting that's collaborative. Is it the beta waves that I want? Or if I'm running a test, is it like gamma? And like, does your technology break those things down? And
we have,
how does sound come in?
Yeah, a lot of people say they do. There's different brainwave trainings for different times of the day or different purposes, just like you're saying, exactly right. So in the morning, for instance, if we were waking up like our ancient, the ancient people did, we'd be laying on the ground, the warmth of the earth, the sunlight would wake us up. We would wake up. We wouldn't hear an alarm clock stressing us out, things like that. And we would make our own norepinephrine, dopamine, and cortisol. So what happens is nowadays, people run to the coffee machine and they automatically stop that whole function. If the brain is going to quickly offload any work. So it's going to become dependent on coffee if you do that. I always recommend the first brainwave entrainment is in the morning. We call it digital coffee because we want to wake our brain up with our own norepinephrine, cortisol, and dopamine. This will give you high focus. Now you can use these high focus sessions. We call it SMR. So when we did our dementia study where we took everybody in the study off dementia scale in less than 6 weeks, it was because of this one brainwave. And the brainwave is between alpha and beta. So think of beta as your reactionary mind. We need that to function when your subconscious is taking over and you're driving your car, running, doing whatever you need to do, where you're not, when you find yourself not quite there, you're just doing something, you're kind of more in sometimes the old commercial work, I can't believe I ate the whole thing, or I did this, basically the beta brain took over and was running it. Now, beta also is the only brainwave state that houses fear, frustration, and anxiety. All negative emotions come from that one state. And in that state, you'll notice lack of breathing. That's why breath work is so important now and come to the forefront, because the breath work will actually trigger into our physiology. Now, when we drop down into alpha, that alpha time, when you're doing a meeting or you're doing those kind of things, that's where that alpha brainwave, they say that Einstein functioned mostly in alpha. That's why he could visualize himself on that light beam flying through space. He wasn't the logical professor like we all had in college, that if it wasn't in a textbook, it wasn't real. He thought outside the box. So I think for business meetings, the best entrepreneurs are those that have that kind of whole brain thinking. They can be left brain logical, they can be right brain creative. And it's not really a brain frequency. It's not really a brain thing. It's a frequency of the brain. So if you have, when we're functioning right now, if in an awakened state, Dr. Ann Weiss, who was our researcher, she wrote a book called The Master Brainwave. And she went around the world studying brains. And what she found out from captains of industry to meditators to gurus was that they all had an awakened brain profile. All the top ones had the same profile. Now, what they did with it was different. So 45% of your brain should be in beta when we're talking right now. 30% of your brain should be in alpha. This gives you that logical and that creative kind of going back and forth kind of state. then 20% of your brain should be in theta. Now, at the time, they didn't know a lot about gamma. We can talk more about that because now gamma is coming to the foreground because of Alzheimer's and dementia. And also think of gamma, the gamma brainwave, as the bass drum for the brain. So we need to have a bass drum that keeps everything in order, and that's your delta brainwave. And it's a very fast brainwave, somewhere between 40 and they've measured up to 300 cycles per second on some master meditators. Now the average person doesn't go above 60, but when you think about that, that's a heightened state of flow. Like when we're measuring Olympic athletes, pro athletes, surgeons, super creative thinkers, people who are like top of their fields. We didn't know how to measure gamma when Ann Weiss was doing her study. She's passed away now. So I think that if somebody has anywhere between 7 to 10% of their brain in gamma, you're going to see an exceptional individual. They're going to have cognitive skills beyond the normal person. Now, delta is the brain, the state when it's in a deep state of sleep. So there's no programming that happens there. When you think about all the studies they did in sleep learning, the sleep learning always happened when you were in the cycle of alpha and theta, not when you were in delta and not when you're in beta. So we go through these cycles when we sleep, and usually a cycle will last about 90 minutes. So during that 90 minutes, you have anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes of that time where you can super learn. And we call this hypermnesia in neuroscience. So what I mean by that is you probably had a time where you woke up in the morning and you heard a piece of music. They call it an earwig too, where that music just wouldn't get out of your head because it was impressed on your brain and in the state of theta. It's a super learning state. So it's almost impossible for the average person to go to theta on their own. I love it when I go online and people are saying they're meditating in theta. I've measured over 30,000 brains. I've had a handful of people. That's it. And I've measured gurus and everybody, and they didn't have a lot of theta going on. In fact, in America today, I think that's, for adults, that's the brainwave that's missing. That's why 2/3 of the world isn't sleeping. Your brain works more like an analog clock, not a digital clock. Like you can't go from being in the beta state of action and doing to delta sleep. It's almost impossible. Some people can do that. They just go to bed and they, 1/3 of the world is sleeping. 2/3 of the world isn't. So that means that they're not calming down, because what did we do in ancient times for sleep? We would have a meeting at the fire, right? We would all be calming down, watching the fire, maybe dancing, having a conversation about hunting and gathering or whatever. That fire was calming down our nervous system, getting us into alpha, preparing us for sleep. So we need to think about that as we go through our day-to-day life and in the cycle of our day. We should start mimicking the cycle of the sun, like you're talking about the circadian rhythm, because our body is designed for that. When you think about jet lag, even, I tell people it's not jet lag, it's light lag. Our body is designed, when we're sitting here, I'm in North Carolina. I'm not sure, Jeremy, where you're at. Where?
Yep. Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Okay. So in Nova Scotia, so we're in different time zones, right? So the light is affecting your nervous system differently than it is mine. So when my temperature decreases at 2 p.m., which happened when we started this for me, that means that I had a low in energy. So I have to do something to pick that energy up if I want to. Or I can take a nap, which I did. Before we got on call, I did a BrainTap session. So I knew that I was going to be doing this at 2:00. So I need to reclaim that energy. So, we're designed, these bodies were designed for the Serengeti. No matter where you live in the world, they were designed to, what happens in the Serengeti at 2:00 in the afternoon? Everybody's sleeping. Nobody's running around. And no matter how much people want to talk about the evolution, you're talking about Darwin, these bodies have not changed in 200,000 years. So even though things have changed around us, we have technology, we have all these things, our DNA and our expression of that is really not changed. Now we've introduced a lot of technology, we've introduced a lot of things, but these bodies don't know the difference. So when we pick ourselves up from New Bern, North Carolina to Nova Scotia or whatever, then our body is going to have to make an adjustment, and it's adjusting it based on the cycles of the sun. And we know this now in science. They call it the circadian rhythm, but the reality is it's photic energy. It's our body. Now, what photons do, just so the listeners know, the reason that red light therapy, any LED light therapy that's now tuned light, that's mimicking the light from the sun, when the mitochondria, you think of the cell, there's that Krebs cycle you were talking about, and how it has what they call chromophore in there that absorbs light energy and stores it. But when it hits the mitochondria, once it starts that Krebs cycle and starts spinning up the ATP production, when light energy is introduced to it, it actually increases the energy of that cell by 32 times.
Mm-hmm.
So as we age, that cell's production of energy goes down, but we know that with light therapy, we can speed that up. So when you have more energy, you have more capacity to do work. So at a cellular level, that's why going outside is so important. But today, because of what they're doing to our skies and the pollution of just toxins in the air, we're not getting the same light that our ancestors got. You used to be able to go outside and get all the vitamin D you need. They've done studies now in New York City where they had people get up on top of the skyscrapers and do sunbathing. And even though they were out there for 2 to 4 hours, they weren't getting enough sunlight because we're not getting the same light from our sun because we're being shielded from our pollution and things like that is causing our body not to get the same level of light energy that we need. So that's why I think we need to, when I said that it's the most underprescribed nutrient, is we need better light. John Ott, who is probably the most researched guy about lights, he had something called the Ott light generator. That was the first thing you'd put next to your desk for seasonal affective disorder when you were living in like Canada and places like that, where you're not getting as much light as they do in Florida and things like that.
Yeah. I can attest to what you're saying, with respect to the circadian rhythm. I've done an N=1 study, and I've looked at, tens of thousands of athletes, and I've seen, the metric, the KPI, I'd say the heart rate variability, it's actually a double peak with a trough in the middle of the day. And so like heart rate variability, for example, if you are showing up with a higher heart rate variability, you're more responsive. Let's say if you were a musician, you would have an epic jazz session if you were at your peak HRV. If you were a sprinter, your reaction time would be the best. If you were a negotiator, you would be most collaborative. That's really when we're at our best. And so one of the things that I do with the coaching with entrepreneurs is I help them find where their double peaks are. And, so on average, they'll know. And there is a genetic component to this also, that you probably heard the notion of, a night owl or a morning bird, et cetera. And then, okay, well, that may be your predisposition, but maybe your lifestyle doesn't support that genetics. So how do you augment, or how do you manipulate the environment artificially, so that you can, perform the best under those scenarios. But, what I'm hearing from you in terms of the application of this technology is, it sounds to me like you don't just want to buy the device, put it on, and cross your fingers and hope for the best, right? I think it's kind of like, I think you do need a level of self-awareness. That is to say, well, maybe there's a particular goal. Okay, maybe it's to increase your sleep, and that's where you start. And maybe that's it, is you get to first things first. And so maybe, since 2/3 of people struggle with sleep, let's say the odds are 2/3 of people are going to want to start there. But then, you're going to get that. And let's say we're going to gradually move the 1/3 of the population who isn't getting, or who is getting sufficient sleep, to 2/3, and to, 3 out of 3, so that we're all sleeping well. And then the next thing is, well, you start to look at your day and you say, well, during the course of a day, there's certain periods of time where I'm doing deep work. There's certain periods of time where I'm doing more administrative tasks. There's certain points in time where it's creative, collaborative, social, et cetera. And, so of course, I don't think we can be so, stringent as to combine each day as a thing. It might be more sense to like zoom out and say, okay, what does my week look like? So I hear what you're saying, and I can't help but think about, say, for example, a sprinter's training program. Their nervous system can really only handle 2 sprinting sessions a week. You're just going to be flat otherwise. Maybe with some performance enhancing drugs, you get an extra session there, but then you're vulnerable to injury. So I guess my question is to you: how does you're obviously a power user, and you just went through a use case where you're like, well, I knew I had a podcast and I wanted to, put my best self forward, and you saw it. Good thing you did, because at the outset of this, what I like to say to people is, like, pretend this is your last podcast. What would you want to say to everybody? So you're using it instead of a cup of coffee to get up, say, oh, I'm using this light thing because, I think as far as I can tell from what you're saying, it doesn't seem there's any, short-term or long-term negative effects from this. And so let's go with that. What does a week look like for you? So you told me what today looks like. Do you go in and, do you plan your, Sunday at the outset and say, okay, in the way that people plan a meal plan, do you plan your light plan, I guess is what I'm saying?
Yeah. I always start my mornings off by doing sessions in the morning because I'm a big believer is if you win the morning, you win the day, so you set yourself up. And I do believe I'm 60, I'm going to be 63 next month. So, I want to keep my energy level up. And I think we live in an energy economy. So if we're waiting for the world to give us energy, we're going to be at a loss all the time. We've got to think about filling up our gas tank. So during the weekends, I don't do as much. I do usually 2 to 3 sessions every day because, of course, it's my job, and in my office, I have that, But I'll just tell the story of the peak performance study we did with Julia Arch with the peak performers at Google and Microsoft. These were all the top 1%. And during COVID, when they came back to work, they had the mass exodus down here in America, people leaving their jobs because it's a very stressful environment. And so they asked, what can we do for these people for burnout? I said, well, they're burning out because when you get to about 2:00, everybody in your day, like you can see it with the HRV. We do that also where we show them across time. But if you can't give yourself enough coffee to get your energy back up, you can synthetically do it. But then if you're using biologics, you're going to burn out. So it's like using having a 70-watt light bulb, you're running 100 watts through it. So but your energy can be increased. So what I told her was, I said, they don't have a lot of time. These are people, most people don't know this, but these programmers get promotions or they get bonuses based on how many keystrokes they make. So they have to be sitting at their computer the whole time. So I said, well, you have to do a 20-minute session at 2:00 in the afternoon. Oh no, we can't do that. I said, give us 2 weeks. I guarantee you will not stop doing it. Got them to do that. We had them take several tests. We published the study. It's a peak performance study test that we did. We showed them by taking a 20-minute break in the middle of the day, not on the weekends, just during the week, during their work week. It increased, their happiness score went up 54%, their sleep improved 48%, their work product improved 23% by taking a 20-minute break. So they got 23% more done by taking a 20-minute break. We call it a brain break now. And so now some people are very efficient at taking power naps, in the middle of the day, like you hear about all the great inventors would do this. They knew that their brain was at capacity, and like having a cup that's full, you need to unload that cup so you can fill it back up again. So BrainTap gives you that capacity to do that. So I always do that in the afternoon when I always know when, and if you looked at my schedule, between 2 and 4 is always blocked off to do things like this that we're doing right now. Those are times that I have available to it. But if I don't have something, usually every day I do have something in one of those hours, but the other hour is my time to do my session because I know I'm going to be tired. It's just a matter of, if you're going, especially most people don't realize it takes a lot more energy to work your brain than it does your body because like I was a sprinter, I ran track in college. So in other sports, I could just go have a protein bar or go do some carbohydrates and I have my energy back. But when you're doing your brain stuff, you've got to eat for your brain. You got to have, low glycemic foods. You got to have the slow burning grains. You got to think differently about your energy resources. And part of that energy resource is rebooting the nervous system. Because if you stay in sympathetic drive, which when we measure people with HRV, like you're talking about, we find that most high performers are constantly in sympathetic drive. So they're cheating. To give you an example, I measured 33 billionaires in India in 2 weeks. Every one of them had a brain profile that told me that they are looking at having a breakdown within the next 3 to 5 years because they sacrificed their energy of their body for their wealth. They didn't do anything about their keeping, nowadays we know, hey, what good is it to retire and expire? You do all this work, so we've got to take care of ourselves every day. So I think that the most successful people now know, hey, it's not just in the morning that you meditate, not just in the evening you meditate. I find the most important time to do your reboot is in the middle of the day. But really if you're a high performer. And if you're an athlete, like with Tom Brady's group, and if you went to him, his TBRX group, you have to have a BrainTap for them to even work with you because they understand recovery. And when you think about, most people don't recover. You can't just do. You've got to take time to contemplate, relax, reboot. It doesn't have to be BrainTap, but you have to do something, breath exercises, maybe even if you work out. Like working out is really good and it can create that BDNF we need for our brain and neuroplasticity and all that. But if you just work out and you do not do, I wrote a whole article for Iron Man magazine about acetylcholine, because when you drop into alpha, you create more acetylcholine. That gives you more connective tissue. It's what builds the connective tissue in the mind-muscle junction. So if you wanted blood dope, your brain, the most powerful pharmacy on earth, can do it for you if you're relaxed. Those people that are in the gym and they're just pressing all the time and struggling, they're not going to build as much muscle as the person who's relaxed about it and goes through their reps and then recovers, takes the time for their muscles to recover between each rep.
Just since we were on the topic of athletes, it made me think of, a technology I tried before through Halo Neuroscience. I mean, different from yours where, I understand BrainTap is more light and sound. Halo Neuroscience is more electrical stimulation. So DCS, I believe, to enhance neuroplasticity. It's more focused on motor cortex activity. And so, but you're saying, so they're different techniques. I wonder if you could just spend a moment on, this field in general, because, there are a ton of different devices that are emergent. And it seems to me that you have probably been in the market first. What do you think? Is it crowded? Are they all created equal? Like for people trying to navigate on Amazon, let's say, how are we going to know the difference between your device or some other?
Well, I know that. Yeah, I know the Halo, didn't get it well used because it's using one sensory-based system. Yeah. So we are, the more sensory-based systems we can incorporate into this algorithm, like we use light, sound, and frequency. So we also recommend certain essential oils if we want to bring olfactory into it, because the more senses we can bring into it, so we can create an environment. Remember, our environment changes our gene expression. So if we can change the environment, our body doesn't know the difference between real or imagined. So like Halo, the research I saw, and they also have one like that for golf, where people do it to get them into the zone while they're golfing. And so they're using the same principles of frequency following response, but most of them only use like PEMF, some kind of frequency generator, which I love. I think they're great technologies. It's just ours, you don't use while you're doing things. Ours is more a recovery tool. So people will be creating these kind of focus tools. Like there's also the Apollo watch. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I haven't seen the Apollo watch. And what that does, it will register when you're having a stress response, and then it will feed back a frequency to you. So you become aware that your body's in a state of stress, which is nice. Now you can start to do something about it. A lot of people don't even know they're under stress. They get so stressed and then they blow up on their family, or somebody that will take them back because, but if we start to learn what are our stressors in our life, there's actually a watch called the No Watch, which actually also does the same thing. Every time you're having a stressful experience, you just reach over and click the button and it will register all your HRV parameters and all that at that moment. So you can start to know, hey, when I was on that phone call with Betty, I stressed out, what was going on? Maybe I can change it. So I think awareness, we're going to find more and more of these devices coming out. And I don't think it's overcrowded yet. I think what's going to happen is those that really work are going to emerge. And, some people are just looking at it to make money. And it's not as simple as people think. Like the Apollo one, we could not get that to do what it said it was going to do. We've had it here in the lab. And even though it says it's doing those things, most of the time it just hurt the people's heads because it wasn't user friendly. But the one for golf they have is a band. That one worked really well. And almost like the Muse band. I don't know if you've ever seen that one.
Yeah. I have friends use that.
Those are really nice tools. And there's also one now that's called Friends, FRENZ, which we're experimenting with now, which we're probably going to do some business with because it's really cool. You can wear it while you sleep and it registers your EEG activity while you sleep. So now you're not, the difference between like Aura and BioStrap and all these other metrics that measure your sleep, they're making it up. This one actually measures brainwave activity. So you're doing
Mm.
EEG, and it's comfortable. You can wear it. So I think, nowadays with so many people wanting to know, everyone's getting older, so they want to keep their brain, and they want to keep their functions about them. I think we're going to have more and more of these kind of genius people pop up that will create technologies like you're talking about. And I think it's just going to be pretty soon, it'll just be kind of like everybody has a TV.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to have one of these kind of devices to train their brain.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. I want to understand how you see the future a little bit with, democratizing technologies like this, like returning to your original vision mission there is to unlock 1 billion brains. Maybe before we jump to that, just quickly, like, what about the opposite? What about the sensory deprivation chambers? What are your thoughts there? Because it seems,
I
I don't
think
want to call it.
I think
Yeah.
they're great as long as the
Mhm.
person is mentally stable.
Yes.
When you think
Sure.
about words, Bruce Lipton actually is the one who kind of coined the term epigenetics back about 30 years ago and started using it and talking about it. And he says that words will change 3,200 gene expressions. So when you're in a
Mhm.
deprivation tank, who are you listening to? Your
Mhm.
best thinking. So if you've already done the work on yourself and you're pretty clear about what you're going to do, I loved it myself. I thought it was a great
Mhm.
experience, floating in the solution and going through there, and but movies like The Fly, of course, get people freaked out. But
Mhm.
if your propensity is to be more of a negative thinker, I would not recommend those, because we need to upgrade their thinking first. I always tell people, congratulations, your best thinking brought you here. Now we're going to upgrade it, because
Right.
every one of us were trained not trained how to think, but what to think. There's a difference
Mhm.
in knowing, if I said, what's 2 + 2? Oh, that's 4. But how did you get 2 + 2 to equal 4? The reasoning mind would explain that and say, it would have that background information. Most of us, unfortunately, learned how to memorize and take tests and pass schools. And if you're a visual learner, you became this honor roll student. And basically, it was a game. As soon as I learned the game, I'm a test taker. You give me
Mhm.
some information, I'll take a test and I'll score, but that doesn't mean I understand it.
Mhm.
So we have to learn, I think nowadays we're delving deeper into the science of how we think rather than what we think, because
Mhm.
we have a massive amount of people out there, especially on social media, telling us what to think, what's good,
Mhm.
what's bad, what's different. I think people need to find out for themselves what's good and bad for you. And
Mhm.
these deprivation systems, and I think we need both of them, because if you
Mhm.
can't be alone with your own thoughts, you got a problem. You know what I mean? Eventually, you're going to have to, you know, come to terms with your own thinking. But I
Mhm.
think some people need some preparation work before that. We actually have series for deprivation tanks on BrainTap to get people
Mhm.
ready, because we do work with a lot of deprivation. We have over 4,000 clinics that use BrainTap. And
Mhm.
I think 6 or 7 of them, last time I looked, were doing deprivation tanks. And some
Mhm.
people have a fear of getting into them. And if they have fear when they go into them, it's almost like when you go to sleep on the couch, you just watched a military movie and you wake up in a dream and you're in the military, you're in the military, playing it out in your dreams, because like Young said, those dreams are going to try to figure out your day-to-day life experience and going to try to put context around whatever's happening to you and try to help you with the future. And it doesn't
Mhm.
know that that movie you were watching wasn't real. It doesn't know you were weren't in the war. So
Mhm.
it's really important how we prepare ourselves. And I think that you, the people that love those deprivation tanks, and I like them. I don't have one here. I have a lot of technology here in my lab in Newburgh, North Carolina. We don't have a deprivation tank right now, but I wouldn't be opposed to having one. I think they're great. It's a
Mhm.
great technology.
Mhm. I mean, this is kind of tangential, but are you doing any DNA analysis to supplement your research there?
We do with, yeah, when we do the research with that, we did it with, there's a DNA group that's, we found out through Dave Asprey in the biohacking group. What's the name of it? I did an interview with the guy it's on my YouTube channel. And
Mhm.
we show that we did a DNA panel before and after with a few people doing BrainTap. We showed how it changed gene expression. And
Mhm.
it's pretty fascinating how that works.
Mhm.
And I think we could
Mhm.
do more. I think that as it becomes more available for people, I think it's super, because people need to know that you're not. When the rishis, the ancient text says, getting up in the morning is like walking into a river. Most people don't understand what that means. When I look at a river, it looks the same. but no part of that water is the same that was there yesterday.
Yes. Got it.
The same
Yeah.
was true with our body. So when we start
Yeah.
to think about our body changing, and if we can know the epigenetic exposure we
Yeah.
have, I think
Yeah.
it becomes very powerful. You start to realize, what am I doing that's affecting me? Why I have this mood or that mood? Well, it could be just because you triggered the wrong gene sequence, from what you ate or what you thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I think that's really interesting. You've got the epigenetics before and after signatures there. So epigenetics, that is like above the genome. I'm thinking even just in terms of purely the single nucleotide polymorphisms, the static markers, other unchanging markers.
Mm.
One of the things I observed in athlete mindset was the genotype specifically associated with this COMT2 gene set, which is is indirectly or directly related to neurotransmitter metabolism. So think dopamine, think cortisol, think stress. So it's kind of central to that. And what I found, a couple of things I found is athletes with, it's called a warrior worrier paradox.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
I dumb that down a bit even further and say it's more of like I call the worrier more of a strategist, and I call the warrior more of a like heads down, get it done no matter what.
Mhm.
I found a greater incidence of strategists, let's say, among like quarterbacks and pitchers and goalies. Not to say that you wouldn't find them, elsewhere in other positions, but even when I looked at track and field, when you even just tell like a 400-meter runner what kind of workout is coming, and those who loved stress and pain, they would really get into the most challenging ones, and those who were overly analytical could become and lean into some inhibitions that negatively affect the workout. And in fact, athletes who are more likely to choke under track and field competition are more like the worrier type, the strategist type. That even correlated with the kind of music they would select before competition. Like a worrier would choose more of like a classical, versus a warrior is more like give me that bass to get up. So this is all like anecdotal, but I think it's a very telling time. It's a very interesting time to get into like precision protocols based on call it predispositions that might be unchanging, but then other predispositions that are changing rapidly as it relates to the epigenetics. And so when we start to think about future application, we start to think about all this, access to big data and AI, and even things like call it, what is it, like the VR headsets, the augmented reality. Like, do you see like your technology being infused with that? And what about the digital signature of an individual? You talk about this aura coming off. Is are we wearing these rather than just these suits that are measuring what our outputs are in terms of heart rate variability, heart rate, sleep, brain waves, etc. Do you imagine like suits that kind of measure the entire emittance of light, and do you imagine feedback loops that help us circumnavigate that? And then what's the point of all this? Do we get to a point where hey, really what we want to do is we want to give you your autonomy back. We want to get you to that self-awareness so that maybe you don't need to quote unquote cheat, or is it just forever spiraling up to new levels of awareness? So, and I'll just, one final contextualizing element I'll put on the question is it makes me think of like Dr. Stephen Covey's work with 7 Habits. Be proactive. So that is choose your response rather than being reactive, right?
Mhm.
And then that, as far as I can tell, it seems to be adapted or learned from Viktor Frankl's position, which is how we choose our responsibility in the face of all of this liberty. Like combining those two things is how we get to the human transformation, maybe how
Yeah.
we move to the singularity event. So how do you see our humanity being merged with technology? Is there a singularity? If there is, what is it?
I think we will have a singularity at some point, but nothing's going to compete with the human brain. I think we're going to have assisted, like the internet assists us every day. I mean, AI is assisting us every day, but there are clothing right now that you're talking about. There's clothing out there. There's a company called Intelligent Threads, which it's spooky the way that it works. It aligns your body when you wear this clothing. And it's got silver threads in it that run this energy pattern, and it keeps your body aligned. So I think we're going to have more and more of this because unfortunately, we're polluting our world. So technology is causing problems, but technology will save us. It always has. So there'll be some kind of technology that will happen. And it's really, for us as humans, I think it's still all about energy. If we keep our energy up, our body can heal. If our energy goes dormant, then that's when those zombie cells and the cancer cells and everything go crazy in the system. And we just need to keep our energy up. And so they're going to create clothing that does that. And I think we're going to, whether we'll be how jacked in like Elon Musk wants us to do or whatever, who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, if I want to learn martial arts, I just go into the club and I pay them money and they download the chip for, Bruce Lee. And then I walk out and do that. I don't know how far away we are from that, but there's actually a book called The Science of the Impossible that anybody wants to read. It's an incredible book. The scientist talks about what is in sci-fi movies and when he thinks it's going to happen in the reality. And I'm kind of in that. I think that anything that we can perceive, somebody will figure out a way to make it work for us. And I think that because we're the only animal that needs clothing, right? I mean, to survive, we couldn't walk around naked. I mean, in most, I wouldn't want to be in the Yukon without clothes on, right? But the antler, the elk and the bear can do it, but we can't. So I think that we're going to have to come up with some kind of almost like a spacesuit. And I kind of think of our body as kind of a spacesuit that we're in, because we're not this body. And that's the one thing I think people need to understand is you're not the body. I mean, they did a study with, there was a movie called Coma years ago where they had people hanging from these wires. And they said that was an experiment done to find out what happens to the body when we die. And what they found out was the average person lost 3/4 of an ounce when they died, but nothing changed except for life. So what is that 3/4 of an ounce? What's that? That's the energy that we are. So we're the energy that animates this suit. And if we can maximize this function and we can maximize our energy and get our consciousness to operate at a higher level, then I think that's where we're at. I mean, we're just evolving our environment. Our environment's going to extend out. Like we live in homes now. We don't live in caves. We're going to keep evolving. And I think that at some point, I don't know if we're going to have robots that become sentient like Carswell talks about, but AI sometimes seems like it's conscious to me. It's like, what's the difference? So, but I think that as long as we look at how is it benefiting us as a culture, and the reason that I want to better 1 billion brains is I think that there's something called the morphogenetic field. It's been proven that the field of energy, in sports, even when Bannister ran the 4-minute mile, how many people ran the 4-minute mile the next year? I mean, they developed the light bulb in 3 different places on the planet at the same time. How did that happen? There's this coincidence. How many times have you heard people talk, maybe even yourself, you have an experiment, you come up with an idea, you think it's the greatest thing, you didn't do anything with it. A few months later, you see it out there and you go, what happened? I thought about that when I should have taken, because it's in the field. So I think that right now, unfortunately, we're being driven by a lot of fear-based thinking because that's how we were brought up. I mean, we're here because our ancestors made it. Their DNA made it. The DNA that didn't make it, that if you want to call it dumb DNA, it got eaten or fell off a cliff or whatever. We're the smart DNA, right? We're the smart ones, or at least our ancestors made it. We took the cues of reality, the visual, auditory, kinesthetic cues in reality, and we survived. So we're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep upgrading our environment so that we can keep upgrading our access to it. We had no idea. In 2015, they actually found out that we have a glial lymphatic system. In 2015, if you went back to 2014, anywhere on the planet, there was no lymphatic system in the brain. All physiology books stop the lymphatic system here. That was just in 2015. What else is already inside of us? There's a person right now that we know in California has something called the stratosphere. It uses altitude training to retrain the cells of the body to go reverse aging backwards. They've actually started to develop lung tissue that they've never seen before. We haven't stopped evolving yet. We just haven't had the triggers which have our body, because our genetics, it locked away inside of us. I don't know if you're familiar with radionics. You ever heard of the study of radionics, the fields? Well, radionics, they've approved it for animals for health, but they haven't approved it for people. But they did a study with seeds that were genetically modified, because these genetically modified seeds, you can only plant them once and they don't work. But what they did was they used a frequency, and they exposed these seeds to this frequency, this regenerating frequency. They went back to being heirloom seeds. So what that tells me is you have a seed inside of you. You have a genetic memory. You have a pattern for your excellence. It's inside of you right now. And I used to use the analogy of CDs. So some of your listeners might remember when you used to get AOL, they'd send you a free CD, right? You'd put it in your computer, and then you'd have to call up and get a code. And then it would unlock that CD. Until you had that code, you couldn't unlock that program.
Right.
Guess what? You have a code. When you unlock that code, you have no idea who you are. You are far greater than you've ever thought. You have potentials. I mean, when old ladies, 90 years old, can pick up cars off their grandkids. There's a story told that Jack Canfield, a friend of mine, wrote in Chicken Soup for the Soul. He went there and he said, you must be really proud of yourself. You saved your grandchild, but she didn't go outside for 3 months after that happened. And she said she was embarrassed. He said, why would you be embarrassed? You picked up the car from your grandkids. She said, I'm 93 years old. I picked up a car. What could I have done with my life if I knew I had that potential? We all have that potential inside of us. So genetics is one way we're finding out that we can unlock this potential. Now, somebody's going to figure out that code, just like that AOL code that's going to unlock somebody. Once they unlock that code, that's the singularity I'm interested in, because that will unlock consciousness. Because just like Jesus said, what he's done, we can do, because he's already done it. Somebody's going to do it. They're going to teach us how to do it. Like an athlete, somebody ran the 4-minute mile. Now other people can run the 4-minute mile. High schoolers are running 4-minute miles now, for God's sake. For years, they thought that was virtually impossible. So, I mean, we have no idea who we are, what we are. We're scratching the surface. We're not evolved yet. We're just playing around. As soon as we figure that out, the life is going to be much different. And if we're going to be spacefaring, which I think we will be, we have to build suits. We'll work with our biological system that keeps us in a cocoon, really, of health and healing for this planet, because these bodies were designed for this planet. But if we leave this planet, that's why, like NASA had to figure out how to, because we lose so much muscle mass when we get into space, how can we keep that muscle mass? So there's a lot of problems that the space program is actually solving for us here on Earth, because eventually we're going to have to move out, and go to other planets.
Would you go with Elon Musk to Mars?
Maybe if I was younger. I think now I'm looking. I have 88 acres here in New Bern. I'm building into a healing retreat center. I'd rather be here and figure it out. If I was younger and I had, and I thought, or if they figure out a way to trigger that gene that reverses the aging process, because they did the studies with genes in Harvard. I wrote a whole paper on it where they kept the cells of a chicken heart alive for over 25 years. Because they gave it the right light, and they detoxified it. And they said the only reason it died was a janitor forgot to turn the lights on one weekend or something like that. But they said they actually postulated that our cells could live forever if proper nutrition was given and detox was there. If the toxins wouldn't build up in the cells. So somebody will unlock that one, and then we will have the fountain of youth. At that point. But until then, we have to deal with, right now, the reality is that if you can live to be 100 years old, you're considered ancient around here. But in the scope of reality, 100 years old is nothing. It's like changing your shirt, when you think about how long life's been on the planet.
Dr. Patrick Porter, I could talk to you for another 3 hours, and I do want to on another episode, absolutely. But for our listeners' benefit, how do they find you? And how would they connect?
Yeah, they can find us at braintap.com. They can go get their free trial on the app and figure out what I'm talking about and try it for themselves. They can also follow me on social media at Dr. Patrick Porter. There's a lot of videos. We have little shorts and little tips for the brain and how they do it, and some other podcasts like what we're doing here throughout the years. I usually do anywhere between 50 to 100 podcasts a year. So there's a lot of different ways. People like yourself asking questions I've never heard before. So, sometimes, people come up with some questions that are different and unusual, so they can research there and find me.
Oh, that's great. Well, And actually, just to clarify, there's the app. Is that a standalone apart from the device?
Yeah, you can use the app without it. We've, like in our study with the coal miners in Australia, we improved their
Mhm.
sleep by 70% in 6 weeks using the app alone. It was 3 weeks when they used the headset. So it just
Mhm.
takes a little bit longer when
Got
you're
it.
just using
Okay.
sound alone, just across the
Let's pause
board.
there. Thank
Sound
you
doesn't
so
make
much
the
for
changes as
joining. And
fast, but they will make the changes.
got it. Got it. Yeah. So let's put a pin in the dialogue there. Certainly want to circle back with you. I'll be putting the details of how to contact with you in the show notes. Again, as my web presence upgrades, we'll also connect people to you, to your affiliate programs, through the website drjeremykoenig.com. So really looking forward to future conversations. Dr. Porter, thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of the DNA of Things. What an enlightening experience in our collaborative conversation with Dr. Patrick Porter on the topics of neuroscience and brainwave technology. I hope you've gained valuable insights into how light, sound, and frequency can enhance your mental performance and overall well-being. From understanding the profound impact of brainwaves on our daily lives to exploring practical applications of BrainTap, today's conversation offered a glimpse into the future of mental health technology. And we uncovered through conversation the brain's potential, how vast it is, and with the right tools, you can unlock new levels of performance and resilience. If you found this episode inspiring, please share it with your friends and family. We are building a community of creators. So if you found this inspiring, please do pass it on. Your support helps us bring more groundbreaking discussions to the podcast realm. So also don't forget to check out BrainTap, links in the show notes to explore the benefits for yourself. For more information and updates, please visit drjeremykoenig.com and follow us on social media. Handles there are drjeremykoenig.com. Until next time, keep exploring the DNA of things, things that make you uniquely you.